Join us on this animated adventure through the pursuit of happiness, a story filled with determination, resilience, and one man's unwavering quest for his dream. The movie starts in San Francisco in 1981. Chris Gardner, the main character, makes a living by selling medical devices. Every day, he drops his son Christopher at daycare before visiting hospitals to sell his devices. Chris struggles because he needs to sell at least one machine each month to survive, but hospitals find them too expensive and unnecessary. This forces him to ask his wife Linda, who already works 2 jobs, to pick up their son. During dinner, Chris spots a Rubik's Cube, which is a new puzzle toy at the time. Linda questions Chris about their taxes, and he admits he needs to file for another extension, adding to her stress. Once Linda leaves for work, Chris tries and easily solves the Rubik's Cube. The next day, Chris meets a businessman with a fancy car and asks about his job. The man says he's a stockbroker. Chris thinks you need a high education for that job, but the man says it's more about good math and people skills. Chris wonders why he can't be as happy as the people around him. The next morning, Chris tells Linda he plans to become a stockbroker, which she finds absurd. They argue because they're behind on rent, and Chris decides to apply at a brokerage firm. Chris leaves his medical device with a street performer because he doesn't want to carry it into the firm, calling this decision foolish. While applying, Chris sees the performer stealing his device and chases after him but loses him on a train. Chris promises Linda he'll sell the device so they won't see it again. He drops Christopher at daycare and shares a story about his nickname 10-gallon head from Texas. Chris delivers his application to Jay Twistle at Dean Witter Reynolds but has a short talk because Jay is busy. Later, Chris spots the performer with his stolen device, chases them, and retrieves it, but now he has 2 devices instead of selling them off. Linda is upset to see both devices at home. After giving Christopher a basketball, Chris tries to explain the day's events to Linda, but she's not interested. Chris catches Jay hailing a taxi and joins him, claiming he's headed the same way. In the taxi, Jay works on a Rubik's Cube while Chris talks about his abilities. Chris then solves the cube, impressing Jay. However, Jay leaves Chris behind, which means Chris has to pay the fare. Stopping at a stoplight, Chris makes a run for it and successfully escapes via train but leaves behind his device after the train door closes on his hand. That day, Chris calls Linda to apologize for being late. Furious that she missed her shift, Linda tells Chris that she and Christopher are leaving. Chris returns home to find them gone but gets a call from Jay's secretary to discuss a job opportunity. Without a pen, Chris memorizes the number and writes it down at a store. The next day, Chris sees Linda at daycare and lets her leave but insists their son stays with him. Later that night, Chris negotiates with his landlord for more time to pay rent and agrees to paint the apartment. While painting, the police arrive to take Chris to the station over unpaid parking tickets. At the station, Chris arranges for Linda to care for Christopher, and he spends the night there. The next morning, Chris runs for the interview at Dean Witter's, still in his paint-stained clothes. The interview panel is taken aback by his appearance, but Chris candidly explains his arrest for parking tickets. Despite a rocky start, Chris makes the panel laugh, and Jay praises him for interviewing well without formal attire. Chris considers the job offer, learning he won't be paid during the internship, but Jay encourages him to take it. After the interview, Chris waits at home for Linda and Christopher to return. Linda arrives and tells Chris she's moving to New York to waitress, but agrees Christopher should stay with him. Chris and his son move to a motel with a friend's help, and they spend Saturday playing basketball. Christopher dreams of playing basketball professionally, but Chris discourages him, then regrets it and tells him to never give up on his dreams. They sell a medical device to a hospital, giving them some money to survive. The following day, Chris heads to the internship to learn about the trade. During a lunch break, Chris meets and greets Mr. Fromm in the street. However, their conversation is abruptly cut short when Chris spots the device he left behind during his earlier escape from the taxi driver. Chris then chases after the guy carrying the device but fails because he gets hit by a car. Although he can still stand, Chris realizes he has lost his shoe, so he returns to the program with one shoe missing. The film shows various scenes where Chris is constantly ordered around to buy this and that. In the next scene, Chris seems to have no success with the names on his cheeks. He decides to immediately approach the company's CEO, hoping something might happen. Luckily, he gets an opportunity to meet with the CEO. As he rushes out of the building, his internship boss, Mr. Frakes, unfortunately asks him to park his car somewhere. Due to this, Chris misses the meeting. That night, while eating at a diner, Chris tells his son they'll go on a trip together the next day. He convinces his son by mentioning the possibility of going to a football game. The following morning, Chris visits the house of the CEO he called earlier, Mr. Ribbon. He thanks Mr. Ribbon for the missed opportunity from yesterday. Mr. Ribbon then invites the father and son to join them because Chris mentioned they were going to a football game. Seeing this as an opportunity, Chris and Christopher go with Mr. Ribbon and his son. During the game, Mr. Ribbon tells Chris that while he likes him, there's no chance he'll accept his offer. However, Chris gets to talk with Mr. Ribbon and his businessmen friends. While things seem great, everything changes when the IRS deducts money from Chris's bank account for unpaid taxes, leaving him broke. To make some money, Chris asks his friend for the money he owes him, but his friend thought it was already paid. They end up at the motel, and Chris becomes frustrated. Later, Chris retrieves the device he left earlier. They try to sell it, but it's broken. The hospital will pay for it once it's fixed, but Chris feels distressed. Returning to the motel, they find their things outside the room. Chris tries to open the door, but the lock has changed. With no other options, they move again, ending up at a train station. Christopher notes that the device his father is holding isn't a time machine, but Chris playfully pretends it is. They spend the night in the bathroom. While Christopher sleeps, Chris quietly cries. The next scene shows them at a homeless shelter, where Chris tries to fix the device. In another part, Chris talks about learning to quickly finish his work talks because he has to go early with his son to the homeless shelter. They attend a mass there, and Chris studies for his internship exam. The following day, Chris finishes his exam quickly. Outside, Mr. Frome, who just got out of a taxi, asks Chris for money. Despite having only a limited amount, Chris lends him $5. To earn more money, Chris donates blood and buys a part for the device he's fixing. At the shelter, Christopher asks if Mother left them because of him. Chris reassures him that it's not his fault. After Christopher calls him a good father, Chris successfully fixes the device. They manage to sell it, earning enough money to sleep in a hotel. Later, they go to the beach to escape the city's harsh atmosphere. Inside the bathroom, Jay congratulates Chris on his final day for securing many clients. Mr. Frakes calls Chris and leads him to Mr. Fromm, who notices Chris wearing a new shirt. Chris explains that the reason is his final day as an intern. Mr. Fromm replies, expressing his hope that Chris will continue to wear it the following day, revealing that Chris has been offered a permanent position. Fighting back his emotions, Chris expresses his gratitude to the committee, and Mr. Fromm gives back the $5 Chris had lent him. Exiting the building, Chris reflects aloud that this chapter of his life could be labeled as happiness. He then proceeds directly to the daycare to embrace his son fervently. The film reveals that Chris secured $1 million deal. The movie ends with Chris and his son walking somewhere, joking around. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more content like this, it really supports the channel.